You are listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
Well, without further ado, we're going to jump from a new friend to an old friend. So, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome Miriam Weber-Miller. So I know Miriam since we are children. Her brother and I were best friends in middle school. Even though the first day we ever saw each other, we had to have the teachers physically separate us from pummeling each other, but sometimes that's how good friendships can start. It's an interesting life lesson. It tells you that sometimes the fact that you have some passion to throw into something, you can actually get some good results. And, Miriam, you are a partner at Finn Partners, and I asked you to come on because I was reading a blog that you put out, and I thought it was just such a fascinating compilation of a couple of subjects that people normally wouldn't compress together. So first, Miriam, welcome to the Final Say. And it's way too long of a URL for people to see, so go to our Final Say page on Facebook, and you'll see the link to the specific blog. Miriam, welcome to the Final Say, and if you would, give us the high level of what the blog was about and why we should care about fast food prosperity and healthcare.
Hi, John. Thanks for having me on. And I just want to clarify that the fist fight you got into was with my brother and not with me. The first day you met him.
Here I thought you were going to say, but he won.
Hey, I don't get in the middle of that, even how many years later. So again, thanks for having me on. The blog that you're talking about is actually called Fast Food Prosperity and Healthcare, which I think is an opportunity, or potentially a market-based opportunity if one could be found. But it came because in the same week I was reading two different kinds of articles. The first article was talking about what was news based on the fact that fast food workers are striking because they want an increase in minimum wage. They can't live on the current minimum wage. And unfortunately, a lot of the people who are now in those fast food jobs are contributing at least half the income to their family. So the traditional concept of fast food workers being high school kids or college kids who are gaining work experience and need to earn some spending money, that profile has changed, and that struck me. And in the same week, I read, and that struck me, and that concept kind of stuck in my mind. And then in the same week, I read a policy piece that discussed how uneducated Caucasian females, their life expectancy is dropping. In fact, it's dropped by about 5 years, which is the first time in the history of a civilized nation where a life expectancy for a defined demographic group dropped. So we've set an unfortunate historic first. And I put these two concepts together, kind of laying over the intention of entry-level jobs and the decline of life expectancy for uneducated Caucasian women, and I started to think, really, it all comes down to upward mobility in healthcare, right? So we know that as prosperity increases and upward mobility opportunities are offered, people have access to better healthcare. They tend to take better care of themselves as a general rule, and that was kind of the formation of the blog.
So, Miriam, this is such a fascinating subject for multiple reasons. First, you have clash of civilizations that are going at it with this battle. You have the unions who have declined exponentially in ranks over the years, especially as we lost so much of our manufacturing labor force. So the unions really, really want to get food workers in the union ranks. But as you point out, ideally, this should be a starter job other than the folks in management. This should be a way that our kids learn to show up on time, speak the King's English, be respectful, count their change, etc. But you also have a battle here between technology and let's call it fiduciary responsibility. If you're the CEO of one of these companies, you're on the board, and you're trying to return to your investors an appropriate yield, or else your investors go elsewhere and your company doesn't have money to continue to grow. So what happens if labor goes up too high? above what we would call the traditional teenager starting job profile, at some point people go out and say, well, we're going to have self-ordering machines, which you're seeing all over the place. And the next thing you'll see is automatic potato dispensers and milkshake makers and all these other things of which technologies exist, and many of these jobs will go away. And on the other hand, what you did was humanize it and bring a perspective that I really wasn't aware of, which is how the profiles don't meet. Now, I did see another profile you and I haven't spoke of, which is I'm starting to see a lot more senior citizens who are they're on a fixed income, and I'm seeing more. I don't know what the real numbers are, but just anecdotally, I'm seeing more of those folks coming to the workforce. So I think there is a need for us to find a way that these people they're not in complete poverty on the one hand, but on the other hand, as you point out, this should be a stepping stone. And so I think what you've just done is you did what I beg our Congress and even our guests do all the time, is let's be intellectually honest. Are we doing the right thing by simply raising the rate? Or what you're saying is it's really not necessarily just about the rate, it's about where you're putting your spend in. And what you're asking to do, now here's the risk, is you're asking for the companies to inject more money into training programs and things of that nature, which is a bit scary from their perspective as to what the return on investment will be and how we will get it. Now, I will point out, and I don't know how deeply you've thought through this, that if the government is trying to run it, the chances are it'll be too expensive and ineffective, and I won't go into it right now, but I've had some horrible experience on government job programs, horrible experience hiring people off those. On the other hand... Go ahead.
And I'm sorry. I didn't. So that is the whole point, right? That becomes the whole point when we talk about raising the minimum wage, or more than doubling it in this case, because the demand is for $15 an hour. That becomes a government solution to an economic problem. So asking the government to insert itself into the business cycle and artificially inflate wages for jobs that were never intended to be jobs that supported households, which unfortunately they are right now. Instead, what I'm suggesting is a free market solution, which is the corporate business world is continuously labeled as greedy and irresponsible, and wanting to take care of a handful at the expense of the many. And in some cases that may be true, but in the vast majority of cases, corporate America tries to reach out to people and take care of their own employees. Increasing regulation because of the Affordable Care Act, because of environmental concerns, has put so much more burden on corporate America that they can't focus on those additional benefits. And all I'm suggesting at this point is, why not look creatively at a market solution? And the real benefit in this case, of course, nobody's even talked about this, so is it, it's some fantasy response from the fast food industry, right, where they come together and form a corporate jobs training program, which would move those workers out of their workforce and reinstate the intended people to be getting those jobs, and then move those workers out of their workforce and help put them on the path of upward mobility, which would benefit society as a whole.
So I think you raise a fabulous point. I want to touch on two quick things. One is, I believe that something like this, while extraordinarily difficult to get the ball rolling on, could be done far more cost effectively than most people would imagine. Web technology, training programs in the clouds could be implemented very easily. I think there's a big problem here. It's not just about government insinuating itself and breaking mechanisms that would be usually solved much faster, much more efficiently, and for much less money in the private sector. However, the problem is there's ulterior motives. Government, the government wants a lot of these people on their coffers because that gives them a permanent voting block. And I think there's a problem here, which you're pointing out. You didn't say it specifically, but I believe many of these people who are in this path, many of them don't even know. They're being told a living wage and it's not fair. There's plenty of people who go to that job and don't even realize that at some point that woman might be a fabulous real estate agent. It's like they're being like cattle. They're being just blindly led down this path of mediocrity and said, don't worry, the government will take care of you, or you have a right to make more there. And they don't even comprehend what I told you earlier, which is If the rates are forced high by the government, those jobs will simply go away, because there is no way, if I were the chairman of the board and I was looking at the financials and I own the fiduciary responsibility for my shareholders, and those rates go up high enough that machines are far more efficient and they always show up, guess what? Tens of thousands of jobs per company are going to disappear very, very quickly. And once that technology comes in, those human jobs don't come back.
That's right. And then think about the downward spiral on youth unemployment. Everybody's talking about how youth unemployment is affected. So again, you talk about upward mobility for people who were previously employed and in large part have lost their jobs or careers that they thought they had and since the beginning of the last recession. But then look at the downward pressure on youth unemployment, which continues to skyrocket. So those two things are related. And I agree. I mean, if you want to talk about ulterior motives and agendas, so that may be one agenda, and that's why I think that market solutions of corporations and private organizations, even nonprofits, but not government-run organizations, coming together and identifying and saying, what is the problem? The problem is the longer these people stay in these jobs, the more difficult and the more stress they have trying to take care of their families, the more their health is affected, and the less they're able to focus on what they need to do in order to become better and to do better for themselves and their children. And that affects health, that affects upward mobility, and that affects overall how they're going to be able to raise their children. So it's this huge trickle down. I guess it's more like a splashdown, right? Of all these factors that nobody's paying attention to because there's this fight about we should be getting $15 an hour.
Well, so now there's another issue here which I think needs to be said. So you humanize this, but there's an economic issue here. A lot of people, we have this political thing called rights nowadays. Everything is a right. The minute you say it's a right, then if you take it away, somehow you're evil. Everybody has a right to food, clothing, and shelter, and TV, and Obama phone, and everything else that you need, whether or not you work hard or not, whether you can afford it, whether you're disabled or not, which to me, by the way, is the ultimate insult to people who are truly in need, is that lazy folks can reach their hand out and take from the same bin that some poor elderly woman who's blind and whose husband is deceased. That money should be going to her, or some young mother whose husband died over in Iraq, etc. But it's the fact that it's a quote-unquote right. And people don't understand, because they're not even taught the basic economic math in school, that you can't – printing money doesn't mean anything. All that does is give you debt on the other side. It devaluates everything you own, increases the cost of the car or the gas or you buy or the food you buy, etc., right? A 1-pound box of Cheez-Its is now 14.4 ounces or 12.7 or something like that, and it costs 1.5 to 1.3 times what it did just 2 years ago. Right. So people have to understand that these things have a direct correlation, and if you force and I want to focus in on healthcare. If you force people to have this mentality that they're just entitled to free healthcare and it doesn't matter who's paying for it and where the cost comes, instead of educating these people that if you want better healthcare, you need to work harder. You need yourself to have a higher contribution margin. Now, if you said the word higher contribution margin to probably 99.9% of the people working in any of these fast food restaurants, they'd look at you like you spoke Chinese. But the fact of the matter is there's not a kid working there who shouldn't understand the basic principle of a contribution margin. What is my contribution in versus what is as a slice of the pie versus what I'm taking from that pie, and how do I help increase the size of the pie instead of just being the first slob to the table with a big giant tablespoon sucking that pie dry and not worrying about the next guy. And that's the society we live in, sadly.
Well, right. Well, so you have, right, think about, I mean, when we were growing up, the nature of insurance has changed really from insurance to basically a prepaid medical plan. So the expectation when we were growing up was that our families had, for the most part, insurance that primarily protected us from catastrophic injury or illness, and and the high costs associated with that. But when we got sick, our parents paid for our antibiotics or the other prescriptions that we needed. Our parents paid the doctor's office with a check. So what's changed during these years, I won't say how many, is that what's changed is people expect their insurance to cover everything. And the Affordable Care Act, it falls into that bucket, where what people are really expecting is everything to be free, when really the origin of insurance, it should be a protection against something that happens catastrophically. And so the cost associated with what we traditionally viewed as insurance to what it has evolved into, I think has fed that sense of entitlement that you're talking about.
Absolutely, and again, these pieces all come together. If you look at your whole core thing, is we have a whole fast food debate, which is primarily driven, I believe, by unions on the one hand, and on Democratic politicians who are trying to get a permanent voting block. It's a healthcare issue, because the more you force healthcare on these people, the more these go to part-time jobs. So actually, these people will be financially in much worse conditions, or they have to work two or three jobs, which means they're spending what would have been billable working hours, even if it was only $7 or $8 or $10 an hour, and now they're spending that on transportation. And by the way, I think it's important to note that competition does work, and many of these people absolutely are paid a lot more than the minimum wage anyway, because if you can't find people, you have to pay them more. Miriam, we're running really tight against the clock. This is a great subject. If you will, let our listeners know where they could find your blog, and I will make an effort also to make sure that we make it accessible to our listeners, and would love to have you back to talk about other healthcare issues in the future.
Sure, I appreciate it. You can find our our Wellness Wednesday blog at www.finnpartners.com, and click on the blog link. We publish a Wellness Wednesday blog. And that's where you can find the blog that we're talking about, and a lot of other commentary and thoughts about other aspects of healthcare.
Okay, Miriam, thanks so much for joining us today. Ladies and gentlemen, we are up against the hour and a second now, so we will have Miriam back. She's a wonderful, extraordinarily intelligent person and a great mother, and, healthcare is a big issue and a big subject for us. We're coming up on the end. It is Friday.
Thank you.
I hope everybody be well, Miriam.